She didn't cry when he left. She didn't beg. She didn't call his phone 14 times or sit on the kitchen floor or do any of the things that the movies have taught us a woman is supposed to do when the life she built with her whole heart is quietly handed back to her like a jacket that no longer fits. She stood at the kitchen window and she watched his car back out of the driveway and she held herself very still until the taillights disappeared around the corner. And then she made herself a cup of tea. And she sat at the table where they had eaten 20 years of dinners. And she breathed. Because sometimes breathing is the only thing left to do. And sometimes it is enough. This is the story of a woman who kept breathing. Who kept showing up. Who walked, on one October evening, into a room that was going to ask everything of her, and discovered, before the night was over, that she still had more to give than she had ever been told. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from tonight. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not yet subscribed to Letters Never Sent, please do that right now so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Every week we bring you a new letter. And some letters, as you are about to discover, change absolutely everything. Her name was Vivian Grace Holloway. She was 50 years old and she lived in a pale yellow house on a wide, tree-lined street in Charleston, South Carolina, where the magnolias bloomed so heavily in spring that you could smell them from 3 houses away and where the evenings in October had the particular quality of light, gold and amber and slightly melancholy, that makes everything look like it is being seen for the last time in a good way, the way beautiful things look when you have finally learned to pay attention to them. Charleston was the kind of city that had seen too much history to be impressed by anything, and it suited Vivian, who had also seen enough of life to have developed her own particular version of that quality. She was not a woman who startled easily. She was not a woman who needed a room to validate her in order to feel present inside it. She was the kind of woman who could sit alone at a table in a crowded restaurant and look, to anyone observing her, not lonely but simply complete, a woman who had arrived somewhere and was comfortable being there. This quality had not come easily to her. She had earned it the way most women earn the things that matter, slowly, and at considerable cost. She had grown up in Charleston, the youngest of 3 children, raised by a father who drove a delivery truck and a mother who worked part-time at a dry cleaner and who sang in the church choir with such absolute conviction that the entire congregation leaned toward her slightly whenever she opened her mouth, as though her voice was a kind of gravity. Her mother had a saying that she repeated often enough that it became, for Vivian, the closest thing to a family motto. She said that a woman who knows her own worth never has to announce it. She just has to show up. Vivian had tried, for most of her life, to live inside that sentence. Some years she succeeded better than others. She had been a reader from the time she was old enough to hold a book, and she had grown into the kind of woman for whom stories were not entertainment but oxygen, necessary and constant and the primary means by which she made sense of the world she inhabited. She had studied English literature at the College of Charleston and had then done what most English literature graduates do, which is to spend several years being deeply educated in things that the working world does not immediately know how to compensate them for, until she found her footing as a freelance writer and editor who worked primarily for small regional publishers and arts organizations and who built, over 15 years, a quiet but genuinely respected body of work and a client list that valued her the way good clients value good people, steadily and without drama. She had a studio in the back of her house that smelled of coffee and old paper and where she spent her best hours, and she had always understood that the studio was the truest part of her, the place where the version of Vivian Holloway that existed before anyone else's expectations arrived was still fully intact and fully alive. She had met Thomas Holloway at a friend's dinner party in 2001, when she was 31 and he was 34, and the meeting had been one of those meetings that feel, even as they are happening, like they are already a story you are going to tell for the rest of your life. He had been seated across the table from her and he had said something about a book she had mentioned, something specific and considered, not the performative response of a man trying to impress but the genuine response of someone who had actually read the thing and thought about it, and she had looked at him across the table with the particular attention of a woman who does not encounter this very often and thought, "You are real." That was what she had thought. Not that he was handsome, though he was. Not that he was successful, though he was that too. Simply that he was real. That the person presenting himself was the actual person, without distance between the surface and the substance. She had been wrong about that. But she would not know it for a very long time. They were married in the spring of 2003 in a small ceremony in a garden that belonged to friends of her parents, with 40 people present and her mother singing during the processional in a voice so clear and so full that several guests cried before the ceremony had even properly begun. They had 2 children, a daughter named Eloise who arrived in 2005 with her grandmother's eyes and an intensity of focus that was apparent from the first weeks of her life, and a son named Marcus who arrived in 2008 and who had, from the very beginning, the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who listen more than they speak and understand more than they say. Vivian loved her children with the specific and permanent love that rewires you at the cellular level and after which nothing is ever again entirely about yourself. Thomas was a good father. She would say this even later, even after everything. He was present and involved and genuinely delighted by his children in a way that she had never had reason to question. It was the other thing she eventually had reason to question. The way he became, over the years, incrementally less interested in the work she did, not dismissively, not cruelly, but with the particular inattention of a man whose attention has migrated somewhere else and who no longer notices the gap his departure has left. The way the dinner conversations that had once ranged widely and with genuine mutual investment gradually narrowed to logistics, the children's schedules, the household repairs, the surface management of a shared life whose deeper currents had stopped flowing between them. The way he began spending more time at his firm. He was a commercial photographer, successful and well-regarded in Charleston's arts community, and less time in the home that they had built together, until the home began to feel, from the inside, less like a shared world and more like 2 separate lives that happened to use the same kitchen. She had tried to name this to him. More than once. More than twice. She had sat across from him at that kitchen table and said, in the careful and honest language of a woman who believes that the truth, spoken clearly, has the power to change things, that she felt the distance between them growing and that she wanted to close it and that she needed to know if he wanted that too. Each time he had said yes. Each time, for a few weeks, things had been better. And each time, slowly and without announcement, they had returned to the same cool and polite distance. Until the morning in the spring of 2020 when he sat down at the kitchen table and told her that there was someone else. That there had been someone else for 8 months. That he was sorry. That he did not want to hurt her. That he hoped, when enough time had passed, they could be friends. She did not throw anything. She did not raise her voice. She sat with her hands flat on the table and she looked at the man she had married in a garden while her mother sang. The man who had said the right things about a book at a dinner party 19 years ago, the man who had held her hand in 2 delivery rooms and built a life alongside her that she had believed was as real as the floor beneath her feet, and she said, very quietly, I need you to leave now. And he did. And she made herself a cup of tea. And she breathed. The 2 years that followed the end of Vivian Holloway's marriage were the kind of years that do not announce themselves as important while you are inside them but that you look back on later and understand were the years that made you. They were hard in the way that rebuilding is always hard, not dramatically, not in ways that would make a compelling scene in a movie, but in the small and daily and unglamorous way of a woman learning to locate herself again after 20 years of being located primarily in relation to someone else. She had to remember what she liked for breakfast when nobody else's preferences were part of the equation. She had to relearn the particular freedom and the particular ache of sleeping in the center of a bed rather than one side of it. She had to have the conversation with Eloise and Marcus that she had been dreading since the morning Thomas left, and she had it honestly and carefully and with the steadiness that her mother's voice had always modeled for her, and her children had cried and she had held them and she had told them the truth, which was that families change shape but they do not stop being families, and that she was going to be okay, and that they were going to be okay, and that she was certain of this even though she was not yet, fully, certain of anything at all. She threw herself back into her work with the focused intensity of a woman who understands that the thing that belongs entirely to you is the safest place to be when everything else is in flux. She took on new clients. She finished an editing project she had been delaying for 2 years. She started writing again for herself, not for publication, not for anyone else, but in a notebook that she kept beside her bed, and that was not a diary exactly but more a sustained conversation with herself about what she was discovering and what she was losing and what she was, slowly and imperfectly, becoming. She walked every morning along the waterfront near her house, in every weather, without earphones, letting the sounds of the city and the harbor be the only company, and she found that these walks were doing something to her that she could not fully name but that she recognized as essential, a kind of recalibration, a daily act of returning to her own body and her own mind and the simple, non-negotiable fact of her own continued presence in the world. Eloise called every Sunday without exception. Marcus texted every few days in the brief, affectionate shorthand of a young man who shows love through consistency rather than volume. Her closest friend, a woman named Cora who had been her friend since college and who was the kind of friend who shows up with food without being asked and stays for 3 hours without being invited, came over twice a week through the first year of the divorce and sat with Vivian in the kitchen or on the back porch and talked about everything and nothing with the easy fluency of two people who have known each other long enough that silence between them is as comfortable as conversation. Vivian did not know, during those 2 years, whether she was healing or simply enduring. She did not always know the difference. But she kept showing up. She kept making the tea. She kept walking along the waterfront in the morning. She kept breathing. And somewhere in the middle of all of that steady, quiet, unglamorous effort, something began to shift. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But she began, in the specific and unmistakable way of a woman who has come back to herself after a long absence, to recognize the person she was becoming as someone she was glad to know. It was Cora who told her about the dinner. The annual gala for the Charleston Arts Foundation was one of the significant social events in the city's cultural calendar, a gathering of the arts community and its supporters at a venue that changed each year but was always somewhere beautiful, always attended by the people whose names appeared on donor walls and program acknowledgments and the kind of invitation lists that circulated through a particular stratum of Charleston society like a shared language. Vivian had attended it several times during her marriage, always as Thomas's companion in the social world that his photography career had given him access to. She had not attended since the divorce. Cora, who sat on the foundation's board, had 2 tickets and wanted Vivian to come. Vivian said she would think about it. She thought about it for a week and a half, which in her internal accounting meant she had already decided but had not yet given herself permission to say so out loud. The thing she was thinking about, circling without landing on directly, was that Thomas would be there. Not because she knew this for certain, but because the Arts Foundation Gala was exactly the kind of event that Thomas Holloway attended every year, and the probability of his absence in this particular year, when his profile in the Charleston arts community had been rising steadily, was very low. She thought about what it would mean to be in that room with him. She thought about who he might bring. She thought about the faces of people who had known them as a couple and who would now see them as separate, and the particular social navigation of an evening that required her to be fully present and fully composed in a setting that contained, at every turn, the ghost of the life she used to have. She thought about all of this carefully and honestly and without flinching from what she found when she looked at it directly. And then she called Cora and said she would go. And Cora said, in the warm and completely unsurprised voice of a woman who had been waiting for this particular phone call, "I'll pick you up at 7. She wore a dress the color of deep water, a blue that was almost green and almost gray and entirely itself, with a simplicity of cut that required nothing from the woman wearing it except that she be present inside it. She had bought it 2 months earlier at a small boutique downtown on an afternoon when she had been shopping for something else entirely, and it had stopped her in the way that the right things sometimes stop you, not because it was flashy or attention-seeking but because it was exactly right, the way a sentence is exactly right when every word is the word that belongs there and no other word would do. She had hung it in her closet and had not worn it yet, waiting without consciously knowing she was waiting for the occasion that matched it. Standing in front of her mirror on the evening of the gala, she understood that this was the occasion. She looked at herself for a long moment. And then she picked up her bag and she went downstairs to wait for Cora. The venue was the ballroom of a historic hotel in the heart of Charleston's Old City, a room with high ceilings and chandeliers and tall windows that looked out over a garden lit with warm amber lights, and the kind of architectural beauty that makes people instinctively lower their voices slightly upon entering, as though the space itself demands a certain reverence. Vivian walked in beside Cora and felt, immediately and physically, the weight of being in a room that she had entered before as half of something and was now entering as entirely herself. It was not a bad feeling. It was simply a full one, the kind that requires your complete attention to carry without spilling. She carried it. She smiled at people she knew. She accepted a glass of wine from a passing tray. She found her table and she sat down and she arranged herself inside the evening with the careful and practiced ease of a woman who has learned that showing up is the first act of courage and everything else follows from it. She did not see Thomas immediately. She was deep in conversation with a sculptor named Helen whom she had edited a catalogue essay for 3 years ago and whose company she found genuinely engaging, and she was laughing at something Helen had said when she became aware, in the peripheral way of someone whose nervous system has been quietly monitoring a room without informing the conscious mind, that Thomas was there. She knew before she looked. Her body knew the specific quality of his presence in a room the way bodies know the things they have been trained for years to know, not with warmth anymore, but with the particular neutral recognition of a fact. She looked. He was at a table on the far side of the room. He was with someone. A woman she did not know, younger, seated close to him in the way of people who are at an early and still charged stage of something. Vivian looked at them for exactly as long as it took to register what she was seeing. Then she looked back at Helen and asked what she had been saying. And the conversation continued. For the next hour, the evening proceeded with the surface smoothness of a gathering full of people who are skilled at maintaining that surface regardless of what is happening underneath it. Vivian talked to Cora and to Helen and to a poet named Gerald who had a sharp wit and a generous laugh and who made her feel, in the uncomplicated way of a good conversation with a new acquaintance, that the evening was worth being at. She ate her dinner. She listened to the Foundation's remarks and the acknowledgements and the brief speech by the artist being honored that year, which was moving in the specific way of speeches by people who have spent their lives making things and have arrived, finally, at the moment of being recognized for it. She realized somewhere in the middle of the evening, actually having a good time. This surprised her. She let herself be surprised by it. And then Thomas laughed. She heard it from across the room, not because it was loud, but because she had been hearing that laugh for 19 years and her body recognized it before her mind did. She did not look immediately. She went still for just a moment, the way you go still when something moves through you that you were not expecting. And then she heard it again, and this time there was something in it, a direction to it, a quality of performance, that made her look. Thomas was leaning toward the woman beside him and saying something. The woman was laughing. And then Thomas glanced, not directly, but in the calibrated way of someone who wants a specific person to know they are the subject of the moment without being able to be accused of targeting them, in Vivian's direction. The table between them registered it. The slight shift in posture. The careful looking elsewhere of people who have understood what just happened and are choosing, with the uncomfortable social grace of witnesses, not to acknowledge it directly. Vivian's table went quiet in the way that a table goes quiet when something has just moved through it that everyone felt and nobody is going to name. Vivian did not move. She did not change her expression. She placed her hands flat on the white tablecloth in front of her and she looked at nothing in particular and she breathed the way she had been practicing breathing for 2 years in the mornings along the waterfront, slowly and deliberately and from the center of herself. And she made, in the space of 4 seconds, the same decision she had been making for 24 months without ever calling it a decision. She was going to stay. She was going to keep her hands on the table and her face steady and her presence in this room intact and complete. She was not going to give the laugh anything to land on. She was not going to leave. She had worn the right dress to the right room and she had come here as herself and she was going to finish the evening as herself, regardless of what was happening 2 tables away. This was not performance. This was not the performance of strength. This was the actual thing. She was 3 quiet breaths into this resolution when she heard the sound of a chair moving. Not at her table. at the table directly to her right. She did not look immediately. She heard footsteps, deliberate and unhurried on the hardwood floor, the footsteps of someone who moves through rooms without needing to announce their movement in advance. And then a man was standing beside her chair. She looked up. He was tall, not extraordinarily so, but tall in the way of men who carry themselves fully upright, without the slight forward lean that uncertainty produces in people. He was somewhere in his early 60s, with silver hair and a face that had the quality of having been through enough of life that nothing in it was still trying to be something it was not. He wore a dark suit without a tie, and he stood with the particular ease of someone who is always comfortable in whatever room they are standing in because their comfort does not depend on the room's opinion of them. He was looking at her with a directness and a warmth that was entirely uncalculated, not the practiced warmth of a man performing a gesture, but the real and simple warmth of a man who has seen something and responded to it the way decent people respond to things they see. He said, "I don't mean to interrupt. But I've been sitting at that table for the last hour and I have been watching you handle this evening with more grace than most people are capable of in their best moments. My name is Edward Calloway. And I would very much like to sit down, if you'll allow me." The table around her was completely still. Not with the uncomfortable stillness of witnesses to something they wish they hadn't seen, but with the particular quality of a room that has just exhaled something it had been holding too long. Cora, to Vivian's left, said nothing. Her expression said everything. Vivian looked up at this man, at Edward Calloway, who was standing beside her chair in a dark suit without a tie, who had crossed a room to say a true thing because he had decided it needed to be said, and she felt something move through her that was not gratitude, though gratitude was part of it, and was not relief, though relief was part of it too. It was something larger than either of those things. Something that moved from her chest outward in the way that the important feelings always move, from the inside out, unstoppable and clarifying and entirely real. She said, "Please. Sit down." He sat. He did not immediately speak, which was itself a kind of courtesy, the courtesy of a man who does not fill silence because he is nervous but who allows it because he understands that some moments need a moment to settle before words are the right thing. Then he said, simply and without preamble, "What do you do?" And she told him. And he listened in the way that she had once thought only one man in the world listened, with his whole attention, with follow-up questions that proved he had actually heard what she said, with the genuine and focused interest of someone for whom the person in front of them is, in this moment, the most interesting thing in the room. And she asked what he did. And he told her, briefly, without inflation, that he ran a foundation. She asked what kind. He said arts and education, primarily. He said he had been coming to this gala for 12 years because the Charleston Arts Foundation did work he believed in and because he found that the people who cared about art tended to be the people he most wanted to talk to at the end of a long week. He said this simply and without any apparent awareness of the fact that he was, in the Charleston arts and philanthropic community, the person whose name appeared at the top of more donor walls and more program acknowledgments than perhaps any other individual in the room. The Edward Calloway Foundation was, to people who knew this world, not a detail. It was a defining fact. It was the kind of name that a man like Thomas Holloway, who had spent his entire career cultivating relationships with exactly the kind of institutions and patrons that this foundation supported, would have constructed an entire professional strategy around the hope of someday being noticed by. And that man was sitting 2 tables away, watching Edward Calloway give Vivian Grace Holloway his complete and absolute attention. They talked for 31 minutes. She would not know the exact number until later, when she thought back over the evening and tried to reconstruct it from the inside. In those 31 minutes they talked about books he had read widely and without pretension and had opinions that were his own rather than borrowed, and about the particular challenge of editing other people's voices while maintaining your own, which he found fascinating, and about Charleston, which they both loved in the layered and complicated way of people who have lived somewhere long enough to know both its beauty and its weight. He made her laugh twice, not with performed wit but with the dry and precise observation of a man who sees things clearly and is not afraid to say what he sees. She made him laugh once, which felt, she would think afterward, like a genuine accomplishment. When the evening's program resumed and the room's attention shifted toward the stage, he leaned slightly toward her and said, quietly, "I hope you'll let me continue this conversation." "Not tonight. Tonight you should enjoy the rest of the evening on your own terms." "But I'd like to, if you're open to it." He placed a card on the table beside her wine glass. He stood. He looked at her for one moment with the direct and entirely unambiguous warmth of a man who is not in the habit of saying things he does not mean. And then he walked back to his table. The room had changed. Not dramatically. Not visibly. But the way a room changes when its center of gravity has quietly shifted and everyone in it has registered the shift even if nobody has said anything about it out loud. Cora reached across the table and took Vivian's hand and squeezed it once, firmly, and said nothing. Helen the sculptor was looking at the stage with the expression of a woman who is pretending to look at the stage. At the table 2 tables away, Thomas Holloway was sitting with his hands in his lap and his dinner unfinished and the particular stillness of a man who has just understood something that he would have very much preferred not to understand. Vivian picked up the card. She held it for a moment. Then she placed it carefully in her bag, the way you place something carefully that you do not want to damage. She turned her attention back to the program. She watched the rest of the evening's proceedings with the specific and clear-eyed presence of a woman who has just been reminded, in the most public and unambiguous terms possible, that she is exactly who she always was. That the years of being overlooked had not diminished her. That the morning she had stood at the kitchen window and watched the taillights disappear around the corner had not been the end of her story. It had been, though she had not known it at the time, the beginning of the part of her story in which she finally, fully, belonged only to herself. And that belonging, that deep, hard one, unshakable belonging to herself, was the thing that a man with a room full of influence and a lifetime of knowing the difference between what is real and what is performance had walked across a room to acknowledge. Not because she needed acknowledgement, but because some truths deserved to be said out loud. She called Edward Calloway 4 days later. Not because she had been calculating the right number of days, she had not been. She called because on the 4th morning she woke up and made her coffee and sat at her kitchen table and thought about the 31 minutes and understood that she wanted 31 more. She dialed the number on the card. He answered on the 2nd ring. He said, "I was hoping you'd call." She said, "I thought about waiting longer." He said, "I'm glad you didn't." And they talked for an hour and 20 minutes, which was longer than either of them had planned and which neither of them seemed to mind at all. Their first dinner outside of the gala was at a small restaurant in the French Quarter of Charleston where the tables were close together and the lighting was warm and the noise level was exactly right for a conversation that neither of them wanted to have to raise their voices for. He picked her up at her house, which she noticed and did not say anything about, because it was the kind of gesture that belongs to a man who does things the way they ought to be done not because he is performing them but because he does not know how to do them otherwise. He brought her a single white gardenia, not roses, not the elaborate gesture of a man following a script, just a gardenia, which is the flower that smells most like Charleston in the summer and which she happened to love, which he could not have known, which meant he had simply trusted his instinct and his instinct had been right. She stood in her doorway holding this gardenia and she thought, "Oh. There you are." The thought arrived complete and certain and entirely without her permission, the way the truest thoughts always arrive. She invited him in for a moment while she put the flower in water. He stood in her kitchen and looked at the bookshelves that lined 2 full walls of her open-plan living area and said, without performing his appreciation, "I could spend a week in this room." She said, "Most people don't notice them right away." He said, "I always notice books first." She believed him. She had no reason not to. Dinner lasted 3.5 hours. The conversation covered the same generous, ranging territory that it had covered in the gala's ballroom, books and cities and the specific pleasure of work that means something and the specific cost of it, but it went deeper this time, in the way that second conversations go deeper when the first one has already established that depth is welcome. He told her about his wife, Eleanor, gone 6 years from a cancer that had moved fast and had been, in the end, mercifully brief in its final stage even as the preceding years had been long and demanding in ways he described with the particular economy of a man who has processed grief fully enough to speak about it without needing the listener to absorb it for him. He said she had been the best person he knew. He said he had spent 5 years after her death being grateful for what they had had and quietly convinced that what they had had was singular and unrepeatable. He said the gala had offered him reason to reconsider that conviction. He said this directly and without apology, which was the only way he seemed to know how to say important things. Vivian listened to all of this and felt it settle in her with the weight of something true and offered honestly. She told him about Thomas, about the 20 years and the kitchen table and the taillights and the cup of tea. She told him about the 2 years of rebuilding. She told him about the mornings on the waterfront and the notebook beside the bed and the slow, unglamorous work of learning to be a whole person again after a long time of being half of something else. He listened to all of it with his full attention. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The woman I watched in that room 4 days ago was not someone who had lost herself. She was someone who had found herself, and was still in the process of understanding what she had found. That is a very different thing." She thought about that for a long time. They saw each other again the following week. And the week after that. They moved with the careful and considered pace of 2 people who have each lived enough of life to understand that the best things are not built quickly, that love at this age, love after loss and after the long slow work of rebuilding, is not the urgent and consuming intensity of youth but something quieter and more deliberate and, in its own way, more extraordinary. It is the love of people who know what it costs. Who know what its absence feels like. Who choose it with their eyes open and their history present and all the evidence of their own survivability visible to each other, and who say yes anyway. Not despite all of that. Because of it. Because 2 people who have been through enough to know what actually matters and who still choose to show up for each other, that is not a small thing. That is perhaps the largest thing there is. Marcus called her on a Sunday evening in January, 3 months after the gala, and said, in the brief and affectionate shorthand that was his primary emotional language, "Eloise says you seem different." She means it as a compliment. I do too. Vivian sat in her kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear and looked out the window at the January garden and said, "I think I'm okay, Marcus." He said, "I know, Mom. That's what's different." She smiled after she hung up. She sat with the smile for a while. She let it be what it was. She did not hear from Thomas for several months. When she did, a text message, brief and carefully worded in the manner of a man who has spent time composing something he could not find the right tone for, it said that he hoped she was well and that he had heard, through the particular and efficient machinery of Charleston's interconnected social and professional world, that she had been spending time with Edward Holloway. He said he was glad she was doing well. He said he hoped things were good. She read the message once. She put her phone face down on the counter. She made herself a cup of tea. She sat at her kitchen table. And she typed back, after a long and quiet moment, 3 words, "Things are wonderful." She sent it. She put the phone down. She drank her tea. Outside, a Charleston January was doing what January does in that city, cold enough to be real, warm enough to remember that spring is always coming, the light on the water in the harbor golden clear and going nowhere. Edward asked her to marry him on a Tuesday morning in April. They were in her kitchen, with the 2 walls of bookshelves and the gardenia he had brought her on their first date still pressed between the pages of a novel on the 3rd shelf, a small and private preservation that he had noticed and never mentioned because some things are more powerful for being unspoken. He had come over for breakfast, which had become a regular Tuesday thing, and he had made coffee. He made better coffee than she did, which she had conceded after a month of resistance, and they were sitting at her kitchen table in the April morning light when he set down his cup and looked at her with the directness that was his most fundamental quality and said, "I want to ask you something and I want to say it plainly. I want to spend the rest of my mornings at this table with you. I want that to be something we've decided rather than something we keep arriving at accidentally. Will you marry me?" He said it without theater, without a production, without anything except the plain and complete weight of a man who means exactly what he says and knows exactly what he is asking and has no interest in dressing it up into something it doesn't need to be. She looked at him across the coffee cups and the morning light and the two walls of books that he had noticed first, and she thought about the pale yellow house and the waterfront mornings and the notebook beside the bed and the cup of tea she had made herself the night Thomas left and all the thousands of ordinary and extraordinary moments of the 2 years between that night and this morning that had brought her to this kitchen table and this question. She looked at him for a long moment. And then she said, yes. Obviously yes. They were married in October. 1 year and 3 days after the gala. The ceremony was small and held in the garden of a friend's house in the late afternoon, when the Charleston light is at its most golden and most completely itself, and there were 30 people present, and Vivian's daughter Eloise stood beside her mother and held her flowers and cried through most of the ceremony with the open and uncomplicated emotion of a young woman who has watched her mother carry something difficult for a long time and is now watching her set it down. Marcus gave a toast that made the garden laugh and then, unexpectedly, go quiet in the way of something true that has just been said out loud. He said, "My mother taught me that showing up is the first act of courage and everything else follows from it. I watched her show up for 2 years before she let herself believe the everything else was coming. Edward, thank you for being the everything else." Vivian looked at her son across the garden and felt something in her chest that was not grief and was not triumph and was not even happiness exactly, though happiness was present. It was something older and quieter and more complete than any of those things. It was the feeling of a woman who made herself a cup of tea on the worst night of her life and breathed and kept showing up until the morning came. It was the feeling of having been right to stay. Thomas Holloway learned about the wedding through the same efficient social machinery through which he had learned about everything else. He sent a brief and correct message of congratulations. She did not reply. Not out of cruelty, she had moved past the register of cruelty some time ago, past the register of anything that required his existence to make sense of her own. She did not reply because there was nothing she needed to say. The letter had been written. The letter had been sent. Not to him, the letter had never been to him. The letter had always been to herself. The one she had written on all those mornings on the waterfront and in the notebook beside the bed and in the simple daily practice of a woman choosing herself over and over again until the choosing became her nature. That letter. The one she had been writing for 2 years without knowing it was a letter. It was finished now. And it had gotten the only answer that mattered. Before you go tonight, we want to ask you something. We want to ask whether you have ever sat in a room and held yourself together when everything in you wanted to leave. Whether you have ever made the quiet and enormous decision to stay, not for anyone watching, not for the performance of it, but simply because leaving would have meant giving something away that belonged to you and you were not willing to give it. Drop it in the comments. Tell us about your room. Tell us about your table. Because this channel exists for exactly that reason, because the letters we never send are often the most important ones, and they deserve to be heard. Share this story with someone who needs to hear tonight that their room still has something left for them. And subscribe to Letters Never Sent, because next week we have a story that begins with a box of letters found in an attic that had been sealed for 30 years. And what those letters revealed changed 3 families forever. You will not want to miss it. Some letters are never sent. But here, in this quiet space, they are finally heard.